With all the stories making the headlines now this Tuesday night, it's the ITV News at 10.
The Prime Minister makes clear her determination to help businesses to survive the energy crisis. Speaking in New York, she says help is on the way for those struggling to pay their bills, but she also defended the idea of scrapping the cap on bankers' bonuses.
We've been in a situation for decades where we've had low growth, partly because people have not been prepared to take unpopular decisions.
So how much will it all cost? We learn her plans could end up costing more than the annual NHS budget. The question is, where will this cash come from? Also in News at 10 tonight. Already on the back foot in Ukraine, is Vladimir Putin preparing for full mobilization to bolster his struggling troops? Calls for calm in one of Britain's most diverse cities after riots between Asian communities. 2 decades after being jailed for murder, the man at the center of the true crime podcast Serial is freed. And the moment when the news presenters became the news as a storm struck their studio.
I'm on the air and I'm looking at the camera and I look over to my right and I did like a double take. And then I just saw more water just coming in.
This is ITV News at 10 with Rageh Omaar.
Good evening. A fortnight ago today, Liz Truss was asked by the Queen to be the next Prime Minister. Since then, government business has been on hold during the official mourning period. But after Her late Majesty's burial yesterday, it's now back to business and politics with a vengeance, with Ms Truss explaining today that help with energy bills for businesses at risk of going under, like pubs, is on the way. The details are due out tomorrow, but while she is at the United Nations in New York, ITV News has learned that the government will cover £1 in every 3 spent by households and businesses on energy over the next 6 months, creating the biggest taxpayer-funded subsidy in history. Ms Truss also defended her plans to allow bankers larger bonuses, saying it was all part of her strategy for growing the economy.
Back to work and Liz Truss on the international stage at the UN General Assembly in New York, ready to meet President Emmanuel Macron after she appeared to question Britain's friendship with France this summer. Inside, all smiles.
Thank you.
Thank you.
But at the very top of the Empire State Building, the questions turn to the cost of living crisis back home.
How is increasing growth, looking at every measure we can take? And of course, will be there will be vested interests that oppose them. Also, it will be
vested
difficult.
Interests would oppose uncapping bankers' bonuses?
I'm making a general point that the British economy has not been growing fast enough since the financial crisis. And that has a cost to everybody.
As well as looking at bankers' bonuses, the government will reverse a national insurance rise and keep corporation tax low this week. Ideas that critics say benefit the most wealthy.
But it is politically risky. It will make you look like you're on the side of the very richest.
But we've been in a situation for decades where we've had low growth, partly because people have not been prepared to take unpopular decisions.
You've been in government for 12 years, and you in particular have been in the cabinet for 8 years. And corporation tax has been low in that period. We haven't seen a huge spike in business investment.
Well, when corporation tax was reduced, we did see more revenue coming into the exchequer. We've just had a very difficult situation with COVID that had a massive economic effect on the world. And we now need to bring in that investment to get our economy going. And that is what I am focused on.
And that focus is Liz Truss's big gamble on growth, a plan she believes will help everyone in the long run. But she knows people are suffering now.
I recently met a pub owner in Yorkshire called Stephen Hay, who told me that energy bills mean that he wakes up frightened and goes to bed frightened. You've talked about support for business for 6 months. Is he on his own after that?
What I can say is that for businesses that are vulnerable, who don't have the wherewithal to create their own, to invest in their own energy supply, we will be providing support in the longer term. And that does include businesses like pubs.
So that is more money for pubs and other businesses alongside more money for consumers. With lots more borrowing and more tax cuts, what would the Prime Minister cut? Nothing, it turns out.
With a faster growing economy, we can afford to spend on the public services that we all rely on, like the National Health Service, at the same time as enabling people to keep more money in their pockets. And that is what
Your critics
and
would
the
say that doesn't add up, but you
is
believe
going
it does.
to deliver. It does deliver,
Okay.
and all the evidence is that low tax economies are higher growth.
The question of whether Liz Truss is right on that economic argument will now dominate the political landscape until the next election and could be make or break for her premiership. Anushka Astana, News at 10 in New York.
Businesses then will find out tomorrow the details of what help they may get with energy bills. Already some are saying that if it is only for 6 months, it won't be enough. Meanwhile, the first of the payments for disabled people, announced by Rishi Sunak when he was Chancellor, have begun arriving in bank accounts. 6 million people are in line to get £150.
I'm dreading winter. I really just don't know what I'm going to do.
Caroline loves spending time in the garden, but when she goes inside her house, she wants to know that she can get warm. As a pensioner, she is entitled to some extra help with her energy bills, but she says it's nowhere near enough.
I got out a calculator, I sat down, worked it out. I'm running on minus about £700 a month. I've got a choice between heat or eat, and that is no choice at all. I've been in hospital once before with hypothermia. I do not fancy going back. And here am I, wrapping up in a blanket, wondering if I'm going to live through winter.
I cry most days. Because I'm just frustrated, I'm angry.
Abby's fibromyalgia causes her chronic pain, and she says the rising cost of living is making it worse.
I'm limiting putting my heating on, even though I need heating in regular temperatures kept for my disabilities. It's hard, and obviously it's not just electricity, it's food costs rising as well, it's transport costs, and when you're disabled you rely on public transport a lot.
The government today said some people with disabilities would be eligible for a one-off payment of £150.
For me personally, that will last 2 weeks. With electricity and food costs, it's just simply not enough.
And just as people are struggling to buy food, those that provide it are having their budgets stretched too. The government has promised a 6-month package of support for businesses, but they don't know when it will arrive.
We need something done now, really. It's a full 24-hour operation here, and it costs a lot of money just to keep the lights on. So their energy prices have gone up, ours are going up as well, and then we've got to go and then pass that on to our customers. And they've got energy bills themselves to pay, so it's a vicious circle at the moment.
And what's terrifying for everyone caught in it is that right now nobody can say when or how that cycle will end. Chloe Keedy, News at 10.
And as we saw, Anushka is at the United Nations with the Prime Minister. Anushka, we heard there in Chloe's piece the deep concerns that there are out there. Do we expect further major action this week?
Oh yeah, I think what we're going to get is a really huge package, including for businesses. In fact, Robert Peston had some details tonight suggesting that the government could be spending £1 for every £3 that consumers and businesses pay in gas over the next 6 months. That is a massive market intervention. We're talking about between £100 and £200 billion in a year. It could even be bigger than the amount they spend on the NHS, which brings us back to that question I put to Liz Truss. If you're going to borrow loads and you're going to cut taxes and you still want to keep spending, where do you get the money from? And that is at the heart of her gamble. Everything about her government is going to be focused on economic growth. But look, there are lots of critics out there, critics who say the tax rates she is talking about are no lower than the tax rates earlier in the decade when we had sluggish growth. And secondly, that the pie might get bigger
but that these plans will make everyone more unequal. What this gives us, Rageh, is a very clear divide in politics as we head towards another general election in a couple of years.
OK, Anushka, not just domestic issues on Liz Truss's agenda. She's met the French president today and she meets President Biden tomorrow. What will be on the agenda?
Well, look, I think there'll be a warm conversation with President Biden. Both sides know how important that relationship is, especially when they talk about Ukraine, as they will be doing tomorrow. But there are some points of tension in this relationship right now. For example, over the Northern Ireland Protocol, also over a US-UK trade deal. That was a big promise of the Brexiteers. But in fact, Liz Truss told us on the plane on the way here last night that there aren't even talks going on for a trade deal with the US. She's more focused on countries like India. And then that question I was just talking about, the economics. Critics of the ideas that Liz Truss is talking about, on the left, she wouldn't say this, describe it as trickle-down economics. They say tax cuts for the rich won't help the poor. Now, she says wages will increase for everyone. But guess what Joe Biden tweeted today? I think it was coincidental, but he said he was sick and tired of trickle-down economics. That said, diplomatic sources told us today that Liz Truss is very persuasive and Joe Biden likes a good political argument. So I expect we could have a robust but friendly discussion.
We look forward to that, Anushka. Thank you very much indeed. Ukraine, of course, will be a key discussion point at the UN, but in Moscow tonight, President Putin was a no-show on Russian television. His planned national broadcast didn't happen. It's been rescheduled for the morning. There's no way of knowing what he's going to say, of course, but it will probably relate to 4 pro-Russian areas inside Ukraine, holding votes which would allow Russia to annex them. But it could go further, with some suspecting he plans to mobilize troops for the war in Ukraine after what passes for a parliament in Russia approved a law mentioning mobilization for the first time, which, if it happens, would be a significant step.
It is a long road, and for the past week and more, the Russians have been retreating along it. Today, we watched their fighting vehicles towed away by victorious Ukrainians. The world has waited for President Putin's response to this catastrophic defeat, and it seems the Russian leader is ready to make another high-risk move. He is expected to approve a series of votes to annex occupied land in Ukraine, the result predetermined in his favor. It is a move choreographed across Russian-controlled territory. In Kherson, the Kremlin-appointed leader said they would soon be reunited with Russia. And in Zaporizhia, Moscow's man said the voting would start in the next few days.
Russia is rushing to hold these referenda in response to Ukraine's gains on the battlefield, as well as to prepare for potential mobilization measures. These referenda are an affront to the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity.
The proposal amounts to a further dismemberment of Ukraine. These referenda would make 4 regions part of Russia: Donetsk and Luhansk in the east. These are part of an existing annexation plan. But now also Zaporizhia and Kherson in the south. Along with Crimea, it would amount to 20% of the country. Ukraine believes it is proof of Russia's panic. But 7 months into this bitter war, it is also more brinkmanship. Russian state TV said in the occupied lands, President Putin would be free to deploy nuclear weapons to defend the motherland. And Ukraine's forces continue to take ground. This village is freshly liberated.
Наша земля – это наше село.
This is our land, and this is our soul, says Elena. But the stakes for everyone here are suddenly higher. This is a significant escalation in a war that President Putin has shown every recent sign of losing. It might demonstrate the limits of his territorial ambitions, but it is also a challenge. How far is the West prepared to go in the defence of Ukraine? John Ray, News at 10, Kharkiv.
Robert joins me now from the United Nations. Robert, this is the first UN General Assembly since Vladimir Putin ordered the invasion, as he calls it, the limited military operation into Ukraine. It's going to dominate talks there, isn't it, this week?
Unmistakably, there is a mood here of gloom, even of despair. The UN Secretary General described the international agenda as one of colossal global dysfunction. And there will be further outrage if Vladimir Putin goes ahead with these sham 4 referenda and potentially annexes this territory in eastern and southern Ukraine. It would amount, unmistakably, to a dismemberment of a major European nation. And there is an issue of concern beneath the surface as well. It would potentially change Russian nuclear posture and doctrine. After all, if Moscow annexes this territory, it essentially becomes land defended as territory of the Russian Federation. So any Ukrainian attack on these 4 provinces or on Crimea would essentially be an attack on Russia and would therefore meet the criterion for a potential nuclear response. Now, amid all of that alarm and concern, I spoke today to the Ukrainian foreign minister.
We came here to speak with the nations who share and support our cause, which is the defense of the world based on rules and not on aggression.
Would you like Russia to be kicked off as a permanent member of the UN Security Council? Would that be appropriate?
They illegally took the seat in the UN Security Council as a permanent member, and definitely they do not deserve to be there by any counts.
Now, as the Ukrainians well know, as we all know, part of the reason for diplomatic paralysis is precisely because Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council and exercises a veto. And in truth, Russia is not as isolated as Western powers would like. You know, there are major countries, China, India, South Africa, all of whom are still sitting on the fence. We'll see if that changes if Vladimir Putin further escalates with this idea of annexation. But I think there's no doubt here now that we are entering potentially the single most dangerous phase of the entire Ukraine war.
Robert, at the UN in New York, thank you so much. Now, back home, Leicester's image as a peaceful, multicultural city was punctured over the weekend with fighting between hooded gangs of Asian, Hindu and Muslim men. Leaders from both faiths today condemned what has been going on and said it must stop. People there say it's being stirred up by troublemakers from outside the city.
Saturday night in Leicester, and police struggle to contain 2 large groups trying to attack each other.
Look, again, another one. Wow.
Glass bottles raining down on officers, 16 of them injured. In the culmination of 3 weeks of unrest between young men from sections of the city's Hindu and Muslim communities. Today, leaders from both stood side by side, demanding that it stop.
We together call upon the immediate cessation of provocation and violence, both in thought and behaviour. We together call upon the inciters of hatred to leave our city alone.
Saturday's unrest began when hundreds of masked men marched through a predominantly Muslim area. Video appeared to show them chanting slogans used by Hindu nationalists in India. There have been clashes here since an India versus Pakistan cricket match last month, but the situation has been further inflamed by video appearing to show a flag being torn down at a Hindu temple, an act condemned on all sides. It's happening in a city long renowned for its different faiths living peacefully together. City and community leaders admit they're baffled by the precise cause of the sudden violence, but they say misinformation on social media about extremist elements on both sides is fueling the unrest. Police say they've arrested 47 people, many who are from outside the city.
There will be people that are trying to create that fear and anxiety, and I do firmly believe that some of this spreading of fake news and raising anxiety is organised and it's constructed by people that are going out with that intent.
Police say large numbers of officers on patrol have prevented further violence since the weekend. They say the vast majority of people here don't want it. The test will be whether that message will be heard by the young men on the streets. Ben Chapman, News at 10, Leicester.
2 rail unions are to target the Conservative Party conference in a pincer movement of strikes at the start of next month. Members of the drivers' union ASLEF, employed by 12 rail companies, will not be working on the 1st and 5th of October in their dispute over pay, jobs and conditions. The railway workers belonging to the RMT union, who work for 14 train companies and Network Rail, will also strike on the 1st of October. Caught in the crossfire will be runners hoping to travel to the London Marathon on Sunday the 2nd. The retail mogul and former owner of Newcastle United, Mike Ashley, is stepping back from the business he built up from nothing. The boss of the Sports Direct Group, now called Frasers, had already made his son-in-law, Michael Murray, the Empire's chief executive. Now he's going to give up his place on the board as a director next month. He keeps his shareholding and will still do some advising. Now, dedicated fans of the American crime podcast Serial will remember the name Adnan Syed. His was the real-life murder case told in a drama format in which he was portrayed as the victim of a miscarriage of justice. Now, a judge has agreed he should be released from prison after more than 20 years. The family of the victim, Mr. Syed's high school girlfriend, say they have been devastated all over again because they were not involved in the decision.
Free for now, after more than 20 years of protesting his innocence.
There is a major development in a case intimately explored in the hit podcast.
Adnan Syed has been released thanks in no small part to the true crime podcast Serial.
A stunning reversal.
23 years later, we now know what Adnan and his loved ones have always known. That Adnan's trial was profoundly and outrageously unfair.
Mr. Syed was just a teenager when he was jailed for life for strangling his high school sweetheart, Haemin Lee, in Baltimore in 1999.
To be a 17-year-old kid with no experience with the system, no experience with any of this stuff, it's very difficult to believe in the early stages that this is actually what's happening. This must be just some huge mistake.
The podcast and an HBO documentary threw up questions about the quality of DNA evidence and, crucially, 2 other suspects who were never disclosed to his defence. Pressure built from the show's fans to reinvestigate.
When the case reopened and we got new facts in the case, that's when we had renewed interest and realized that there was a flaw in the conviction.
But the family of Haemin Lee aren't happy. Their lawyer says justice should be decided by a jury, not the media.
What you don't do is you don't shut a family like this out of the process and sort of ram a deal like this down their throat. This was a done deal. It made for good press, but it was devastating to this family.
Tonight, Mr. Syed is home wearing a tag.
We're not yet declaring Adnan Syed is innocent.
Prosecutors have 30 days to decide whether to hold a retrial or drop the charges altogether. Martin Stew, News at 10.
The family of 14-year-old Molly Russell, who took her own life after being fed an online diet of articles about depression and suicide, will have to wait even longer for answers. The inquest into Molly's death got bogged down in legal arguments on its opening day. The coroner said he had not forgotten about her grieving family. It's now due to start tomorrow. The American tech companies Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram, and picture-sharing site Pinterest, are due to be questioned under oath. Now, 2 sets of numbers came out today about the scale of interest in the lying-in state of the funeral of the Queen. 250,000 people filed by the coffin in Westminster Hall, fewer than for the Queen's father, George VI. And the television viewing figures were also at the lower end of expectations, 25 million. That's fewer than watched the funeral of Princess Diana or Boris Johnson's announcement of the first COVID lockdown.
A new dawn at Buckingham Palace. Flags lowered in national mourning returned to full mast. Streets that played host to princes and presidents swept clean. But the memories are indelible. We now know that 250,000 people personally saw the late Queen lie in state, with 25 million in the UK alone watching yesterday's events unfold on TV. But some found that quite unexpectedly, the pageantry came to them.
Yesterday was an amazing experience, like a personal show just for us, really.
Simon, who filmed these pictures, lives on the final stretch of road before Windsor's Long Walk. Although it was packed, the crowds were kept away here. But his family, on the left, were virtually brushed by the bearskins.
They just waited. They were kind of getting ready to go. So they were outside here for about an hour and a half outside my house, all talking and chatting amongst each other.
Others made history. Escorting Her Majesty was Commander Nicola Cripps. It's the first time female naval officers have been allowed to lead the gun carriage.
It was really emotional. At times I really had to fight back some tears that just filled my eyes. But it was also such a tremendous sense of pride. Being able to be part of that contingent was something that, I don't know, I never really wished to be a part of, but absolutely such a huge honour and such a privilege.
Memories of a Queen's last chapter to be handed down to our children's children, just as her crown has passed to a new king. He now has a week of private mourning, today heading for Balmoral, the setting for the previously unseen photograph released by his family in a final tribute to his mother in her favourite place on earth. Rachel Younger, News at 10.
And a postscript tonight to the Queen's funeral service. Details about the inscription above where her body was placed have been released. It shows the name of her father, her mother, then the Queen and her husband, Prince Philip. There is a star in the middle, as they were all members of the Order of the Garter. On some environmental issues where the Welsh Government has led, the rest of the UK has followed. Think charging for supermarket carrier bags. Well, next in sight is the single use of plastic. The government in Wales wants to bring in a new law making it an offence to supply unnecessary disposable plastics to consumers. The banned list will include polystyrene food containers, cups, lids and plastic plates and cutlery. The government says it will limit the damage to wildlife and the environment and help Wales reach its net zero target. Finally, no one said weather forecasting is easy, far from it, but a TV station in the United States has learned the hard way about what happens if you don't take the heed of your own storm warnings. In a matter of moments, the studio, well, filled with inches of water.
We're starting to get that hail now here, Champaign to the south.
When heavy rain, tennis ball-sized hailstones and 70-mile-an-hour winds struck Illinois, meteorologists at a regional TV station were telling viewers about the weather from what they thought was the safety of the studio, when all of a sudden, the storm came a little too close for comfort.
I'm on the air, and I'm looking at the camera, and I look over to my right, and I did like a double take, and I was like, who spilled a drink? And then I just saw more water just coming in.
Sorry, guys. Oh, goodness.
Kevin and his colleague found themselves surrounded by the very story they were covering.
Water is still coming in here.
When 3 inches of rain fell in under an hour.
My other colleague, I could see it in his face. In his face, he was just like white as a ghost and just like, oh my gosh, this is bad. It got to that point where it was like, let's get somebody in here to try to take care of that mess while we're still on the air doing coverage.
Like true professionals, presenters Kevin and Jacob kept reporting as the studio swelled with rainwater, even though the technology could have stopped working at any minute.
If it had gone any higher, it would have got into these uninterruptible power supplies, and guess what? We would be off the air.
But if there's a next time, Kevin will be ready.
As long as we are still on the air and got a signal we can broadcast out, and as long as we're in need to get that information out to people, I do it all over again 100 times.
In a state known for its tornadoes, Kevin and his colleagues are used to chasing the weather. But this time, the story came to them. Ellie Pitt, News at 10.
I'd rather them than me. Our national forecast is next, but that's it from me. News at 10 tonight. Good night and thank you for watching.
Kelly coming into my life has been one of the best things that's ever happened to me.
I'll give you £10,000 to kill Gary Mendes. I guess in some messed up way we're even.
This is what she wanted. I'm so sorry, Kelly.
This week on Coronation Street on ITV and ITV Hub.